freedom and law, through which the former is restricted, are the two hinges around which civil legislation revolves. But in order for the latter to have effect and not be empty recommendation, a medium must join them, that is force, which, united with those, makes those principles succeed. Immanuel Kant. In my last lecture, I talked about public right and about the necessity to have public right. Because to Kant, all right, be it public or be it private, is about what he calls the mine and yours. That is about property. Be it that which is mine by birth, like my body, or be it that which becomes mine at some point, acquired rights, like the right to my house or to my bike. And the right is about protecting the mine and yours. To Kant, right should make it possible for several free beings, free rational beings, to live alongside each other. So the duties of right to Kant are about restricting our choice to him being the faculty to, well, choose which action we may do. And now we should restrict this choice of ours as much as is needed to not interfere with the choice, that is, with the freedom of others. So I can choose to do whatever I want, like if I'm out in nature and there's a tree not belonging to anyone, I can pluck a fruit from that tree, I can choose that action. But I must not choose those actions that would interfere with what is yours. I cannot pluck from a tree that belongs to somebody else. That is what the duties of right are about. And to Kant, even in the state of nature, that is a state when there is no state, there is no laws, there is such a thing as rights, as duties of right, whose principle here is the old neminem leadere, harm no one. In other words, don't interfere with others' freedom, don't touch what is theirs. And this constitutes the private right. This constitutes commutative justice. But the problem is, of course, that in the state of nature, it is not guaranteed that people will be righteous and just. It is not guaranteed that people will do their duty, will restrict their choice, and will not harm me in what is mine. And it isn't even necessary that they harm me out of ill will. There could simply be conflicts about the mine and yours, about what object belongs to whom. And so therefore the state of nature is a state of constant, not necessarily actual, but at least potential war. And therefore we should leave the state of nature. Therefore people should come together and form a social contract that constitutes a civil state, that transforms the private right into public right by establishing laws that are public, that get publicized, and enforcing those laws. And those laws should guarantee and secure each person's rights. So the principle of public right to Kant is the old suum cuique tribue, give to each his own. which he says content-wise is really the same as harm nobody, because I'm harming somebody if I'm not giving him what is his, and if I'm giving him what is his, I'm not harming him. But here it is a positive imperative, not just a negative one, right? Give to each his own. To Kant means not give him the objects that are his. That would not make sense. He already has them, or else they wouldn't be his. But rather give him a guarantee that this is really his by right. Guarantee him that it will not be taken from him. So this constitutes the public right. And Kant says it is a duty to enter a state of public right. Indeed, it is something that can even be enforced, meaning other human beings have the right, if I am in their vicinity, to use force to force me to either enter that social contract with them, to leave the state of nature and enter the civil state, or to use force to drive me away. Because no one has to suffer living alongside another human being without a guarantee that that other human being will indeed restrict his choice and will indeed not harm him. We can demand such a guarantee. That is, we can demand of every neighbor that we may have to live under a common law with us. And this state of public right, as I already said, has 3 levels to Kant. The state right, the nation's right, and the cosmopolitan right. I want to talk about all 3 of those levels in upcoming lectures, but for now I want to stay with public right in general. Because here we now have a new form of justice, not the commutative justice in the state of nature that would depend on people's goodwill. But now we have a distributive justice, a justice that distributes to each what is his, and once again guarantees that it is his, that he has a right to it. And the whole point of public right is to establish justice. That is, to establish a state where everyone has and is secure in what is his, and where therefore this constant war of the state of nature ends and a perpetual peace is established. And the different levels establish peace on different levels, right? The state right establishes peace between individuals, for example, within one state. The nation's right should establish peace between different states. But the point is always to establish peace by giving to each his own and giving to each a guarantee that it is and will remain his own. And so, of course, the general question, before we deal with the various levels of the public right, the general question is, what should that look like? What would be just? And here I want to start by saying that to Kant, the state, and I'm now assuming that we are talking about the state as it should be, the ideal state, the rational state. The state needs to have 3 elements. There needs to be freedom. I mean, that's sort of the whole point, right? The freedom of the people should be secured. Their rights should be in place and should be guaranteed precisely so that other people don't interfere with their freedom. then as a second element, there needs to be law. I mean, that is what makes the public right, what distinguishes the public right from the private right. In the state of nature, when we have only private right, then I can ask my own reason what I think would be proper. Or other people can employ force, can employ violence to force me to accept something as theirs, to not take it. But there's no general publicized law that makes it clear for everyone what rights people have and which object belongs to whom. So the second element is the law. And then the third element is force, because of course the law needs to be enforced, right? The state needs to have a monopoly of power. Otherwise, there could be laws in place, but no one would have to follow them, and the whole thing would be pointless. So the rational state, the proper republic, to Kant has these three elements. It has freedom, law, and force. And he points out that there's an analogy with ethics here. Because he would say that in the good person, in the moral person, you also need these three elements. The difference is just that the right, and I already gave a lecture about the distinction Kant makes between ethics and right. The right deals with what can be enforced from the outside, what can be enforced by other people, and therefore it deals only with people's actions, doesn't care about the inside of a person, about his inner attitude. Like the state only cares that you don't murder. If you do it because you're a good person or just because you don't want to go to jail, that doesn't matter for the state. If you don't murder, you are a good citizen, even though maybe not a good person. But ethics deals with the individual and the individual's goodwill. So here the individual is not forced to act properly by some outside force, but if anything, he forces himself. So we can make an analogy. We can say that in the ethically good person, there are also these three elements: freedom, law, and force. But here Kant would say, well, the freedom is my freedom as an individual. If I don't have freedom, I cannot be a good person. Then I would be maybe ruled by my instincts like an animal, and then morality would not apply to me, right? We don't blame the lion for attacking and eating someone. Then second, we need a law, which would be the moral law. But unlike the law in the state, this would not be a law imposed on us by some legislator who is not us, but rather this is the law we give ourselves with our own reason. We think about what should be done, what would be right, and we come to our conclusion. So here we have autonomy, self-law giving, which I already discussed in previous lectures, namely the lecture on freedom and on do we have free will. And lastly, here too we need force. That is, again, there needs to be a force forcing you to follow the law. But just like the law does not come from outside in ethics, neither does the force. So it's not another person forcing you, but rather you are forcing yourself. Autocracy, as Kant says, right? If autonomy means self-law giving, then autocracy means self-ruling. And this is virtue to Kant. this is what virtue means. Virtue to him is a sort of inner strength, a strength of will, you could say, to force myself, to force down my drives, my instincts, if I have to force myself to follow my rational insight, to force myself to do that which I have recognized as the right thing to do. This too is something I have addressed already in my previous lectures. So you might check out my previous lectures on morality. So again, we have these three elements. In the state, we have freedom, we have law, we have force. In the ethical individual, we have freedom, and then we have autonomy and autocracy or virtue. Now, if these three elements need to be in place for a rational state, for a just state, for a proper republic, then of course we can also imagine people living in a situation where one of those elements, or even two of those elements, are missing. And this is indeed something Kant discusses. So there are several possible unjust states. Let's start with those where only one element is missing. And here, first we can start imagining a state where you have law and you also have force enforcing that law, but you have no freedom. So that would mean that the law is not one that secures and guarantees freedom. It is not one that restricts freedom only as much as necessary. Like, for example, if the law forbids murder or forbids theft, surely that restricts my freedom, namely my freedom to murder or to steal. But it only restricts my freedom as much as is necessary in order to protect the freedom of other people. Because if I were to kill them or to steal from them, that would interfere with their freedom. And likewise, of course, my freedom is also protected by that same law, right? But you could imagine a law that is more restrictive than it has to be, right? So, for example, when the state says you are not allowed to be gay, or when the state says you are not allowed to speak your mind, or when the state says you have to dress in a certain way, right? Like women have to be veiled or whatever. Or when the state says you cannot take certain substances, certain drugs. Here the state would forbid actions that it doesn't matter whether they are ethically good or not, whether they are prudent or not, whether I should do them or not. But the simple matter of the fact is that these actions do not interfere with others' freedom. So therefore they should not be forbidden. This state where you have law and you have force but you have no freedom is what Kant calls despotism. Nowadays people would probably rather call it a dictatorship, but the point is that this is a despotic state. And what's important to Kant is that it is not necessarily also a tyrannical state, that is a state where people suffer. Kant would say there can be such a thing as benevolent despotism. Despotism where the despot actually tries to make his people happy and maybe even succeeds to a degree. But still, if he does not guarantee their freedom, he is being despotic. This would then be a paternalistic state where the people are treated like children that cannot be free, cannot take care of themselves, but need their parents to know better what's good for them. And this is wrong, Kant says. This is also why he would say it is not the job of the state to make the people happy. He would agree with the American Declaration of Independence that says that everyone has the right to pursue his happiness. So the state should not, of course, restrict their happiness. But what the state should guarantee is not happiness, but rather it is freedom. If the state tries to guarantee happiness, that is to force people to be happy, according to whatever the ruler might think is best for them, that is just as despotic as the tyrannical state is. So that's one possibility. And the other possibility, where only one element is missing, would be a state where you have freedom and you have the law, but you have no force. And of course, in this case, the law would be pointless. Like, it wouldn't even matter whether the law is just and rational and a good law that would secure freedom, or whether the law is too restrictive and therefore despotic, because either way the law is not enforced, right? So there might be a law written down somewhere in some books of law, but no one really has to follow them, because the state does not have the monopoly of power. The state is weak, and the state cannot enforce its own laws. And such a situation Kant calls anarchy at some points. There's also other points in his lectures where he calls it the Polish freedom. But of course, that is a more historical term that might have made sense to people in his own time, but would not be so easily understood in our day. The background here is that Poland at the time, or rather Poland, Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that was they were in a union back then. It also incorporated more than just the modern day states of Poland and Lithuania, and also included lots of Ukraine, lots of Belarus. In fact, it was the biggest state, biggest political entity in Europe for a time. But in this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the central government, the king, did not have much power, and a lot of power rested with the nobles. And there was also quite a lot of nobles. The nobility was much bigger percentage-wise. So if you look at the percentage of the general population of nobles, it was much bigger than in other European nations. And the nobles had quite a lot of freedom from the central government. So despite there being a king, you sometimes hear it called Republic of Nobles. And to Kant, this is an example of a state of anarchy because of the weakness of the central government. And he would say that in such a situation, maybe today we would call such a thing a failed state. In such a situation, well, there is not so much difference between anarchy, where you have freedom and law but no force, and despotism, where you have law and force but no freedom, because at the end of the day, the anarchy will lead to some sort of despotism. Maybe not a despotism by one central despot like the king, but rather by many smaller despots, right? Like every nobleman can be his own despot to his own people, because there's no law restricting him. Maybe calling this the Polish freedom could be criticized, because in Kant's own day, there were these three partitions of Poland, right? The neighboring powers, Prussia, Muscovy, and Austria, partitioning Poland between themselves, until at the end of that, after the third partition, Poland ceased to exist as an independent state, and only was brought back into being like 130 years later, after the First World War, where it also only lasted for 2 decades until it was partitioned once again, this time between Hitler and Stalin. And sure, you can say that the partitioning of Poland was only possible because of the weakness of the central government. But at the same time, the weakness of the central government was also used as the pretense, and as the legal justification for that partition, right? So the other powers said, oh, Poland is basically a failed state. It's basically no state at all. There's chaos within Poland, and this is dangerous, and not just for the Poles themselves, but rather this chaos might also get across the border and threaten the stability of our states. And that is what gives us the right to interfere here and to take charge. So, in that sense, we might criticize Kant for presenting Poland in this way, for calling this also the Polish freedom. So, to be clear here, to Kant, this is not a justification for the partition. Kant was very much against the partition. He considered it a grave injustice. But be that as it may, clearly calling it the Polish freedom is a historical term, whether it was justified in Kant's own day or not. As a more general term, we could better use the other term he uses, anarchy, or maybe we could once again call it a failed state. But these two examples, here you still have a state. You have the despotic state with law and force, or you have the failed, the anarchic state with freedom and law. But of course, you can also think of a situation where there's no state at all. And that would be the state of nature. And that would be a situation where there is freedom, but neither law nor force. However, only freedom without law or force is not really possible amongst human beings, right? There would be conflicts. Maybe this would be possible amongst angels. Maybe they could be free without interfering with each other's freedom, without needing a law and without needing it enforced. But amongst humans, this would not work. So, in practice, the state of nature would not really be a state where you have only freedom, but rather it would be a state where you have freedom and force, right? You have no law, so everyone can use force however he sees fit. And sure, they can use force to try and stay free, to protect themselves against others who might attack their freedom. But they could also use force to actually take other people's freedom, to actually attack others. And so this is exactly why Kant says this will not last long. He says a situation with both freedom and force but no law is not really possible in the long run, because freedom and force without the law as a mediator, they contradict one another. For that reason, this situation would likely lead to the last possibility, and that would be a state where you have only force. So no freedom, but also no law. So this would be the rule of the strong, right? This would be what the state of nature would lead to. The force would eventually take all freedom away. The strongest would take charge. And this would be a situation where a situation that is even worse than despotism. Because at least in despotism, there are some laws. Maybe they are restrictive laws, maybe they are unjust laws, but there's some stability, and you can somewhat know how you are expected to behave and what's gonna happen. It's not completely arbitrary. But if there's only force, if it's just the rule of the strongest, then you are completely helpless. You are simply a victim. And this Kant calls barbarism, right? So the difference between barbarism and despotism would be precisely that in both cases there is no freedom. You are not a free citizen, you are just a subject. But in despotism, at least, there are some laws. There's at least some measure of order, while in barbarism it's completely arbitrary violence and complete rule of the strong over the weak. So those are the possibilities. Once again, the proper republic has freedom, law, and force. You could also have a despotic state, which has law and force but no freedom. Or you could have a state with anarchy, where you have freedom and law but no force. Or you could have the state of nature, where you have freedom but no law. And for that reason, there would probably soon arise force. Or you can have barbarism, where you have only force but neither freedom nor law. There is no further possibility, right? I mean, we could also think of a situation where there's only law without either freedom or force. That's a possibility that Kant never discusses, but I would assume he doesn't discuss it because it's just so obvious that this doesn't make sense. Like, we can think it in the abstract way as another possibility, but if you think about what this should be, how this should work, then it makes no sense, right? If there is law, then there needs to be force enforcing that law. And if there isn't, then clearly people are free. If the force doesn't force them to act in a certain way, then you would have law and freedom, and you would have anarchy, right? And on the other hand, if there's no freedom, the only reason why there could be no freedom would be because there's force taking that freedom away, right? The law itself, no matter how restrictive, how despotic in theory it is, the law itself cannot take the freedom away unless it is somehow enforced. So while theoretically thinkable, this is not really a possibility. So these are the various states of right that Kant talks about, that Kant imagines. Again, he would say that there's an analogy between the good, the ethical person, and the proper republic. The good person also has freedom. He has the moral law. He has autonomy. And he forces himself. He has autocracy. He is virtuous. If that is the case, then we could probably extend that analogy to also include these unjust states. Kant himself does not do so. He only talks about the analogy between the rational republic and the ethically good person. But maybe if we think about it, we can extend the analogy ourselves. And indeed, I find that it is quite easy to think of analogies for these other situations. So let's start with despotism. So the state that has no freedom but law and force. What would ethical despotism mean? Well, it would mean that you follow a law. Once again, you force yourself to follow that law. Because if the force came from outside, we would again be in the area of right. This would then be juridical despotism, right? If other people force you. So it must be still that you force yourself, that you have some sort of self-discipline that is analogous to proper virtue. But the law that you follow here cannot be the moral law, because that is a law that gives you freedom. It would have to be a wrong law. It would have to be a law of some sort of false morality. But that would mean that there cannot be autonomy, because if you have autonomy, if you give yourself the law, if you follow your own insight, if you ask your own reason, what should I do? What would be good? This cannot possibly lead to you taking your own freedom away. If you give yourself the law, you are free. So that would mean that ethical despotism would be you following a law that others have given you, you not being autonomous. And this is the case in the case of certain wrong, certain ideological ethics, right? Be they directly ideological or be they based on some faith. So if you got indoctrinated, if you got brainwashed in a certain way, if you got somehow convinced, maybe by the way you were raised, that there are certain restrictive laws that you must follow to be a good person. Maybe you were raised in a church and they have restrictive sexual morality. They tell you you mustn't be gay, you mustn't have sex before marriage, you mustn't even masturbate. And now you are not forced from the outside by the state, but rather you are forcing yourself, right? So maybe you are having some sort of bad conscience about your sexual urges and you're forcing yourself to abstain. This is, I would say, ethical despotism. It's important that you're still forcing yourself, that you're doing it out of self-discipline. Again, if it was enforced by some outside power, this would become juridical. So, of course, the juridical despotism can claim to have ethical or religious grounds, right? So you can have a state that, let's say, punishes homosexuality because it claims that this is a sin. But in this state, if you now follow the law, despite being gay, that is, if you don't engage in homosexual activities because it is forbidden, you now do so because the state forces you to follow that law, because the state would maybe imprison you or maybe even execute you for it. Inwardly, you might still think that this law sucks, that this is unjust. Inwardly, you might still think that there's nothing wrong with you for being gay. So, in that sense, the despotism, while claiming to have ethical grounds, the despotism itself, no matter where the law comes from or how the law is justified, the despotism itself would still be juridical despotism. But if, on the other hand, it is not the state punishing homosexuality, but rather you, being gay, force yourself to not engage in homosexual acts because you feel bad about it, because you feel sinful, you feel that this is wrong, that something is wrong with you, that you shouldn't be like that. You beat yourself up over it because you have simply been raised believing in this supposedly ethical law that says homosexuality is wrong. That and only that I would call ethical despotism. Let's move on to anarchy. So, having freedom and the law, but having no force. Well, this would be the state of a person who is a good person in his thinking, but not in his actions, meaning he is free and he also has autonomy, that is, he uses his reason to think about what should be done, what would be good, but he has no autocracy, meaning he lacks the self-discipline, he lacks the virtue to actually force himself to follow that moral law that he himself has recognized as being the moral law that he should follow. And just like Kant says in the case of the state, that the state that has anarchy is very close or will turn into a despotic state, because now you may not have the despotism of a central government, but each small noble, each small lord or knight can be his own despot. Just like that, a person in this state of inner anarchy, that will also be very similar to despotism. Maybe you will not have the despotism of one singular law, like an ethical despotism, where, let's say, you are in one church and you force yourself to follow the law of that one church. But rather here, you may have several drives, several desires that you have that one day force you to do this and the next day they force you to do that. So you might be under different despots, each desire being another despot. They might even drive you in different directions, but still you lack the ability to actually enforce the law. And such a person would probably be a person living with lots of regrets, living with a bad conscience, because again, he would have a law, right? He would have the autonomy to say this is what I should do, but he would lack the virtue to actually do it. So this would be a person who, I don't know, keeps smoking despite telling himself, oh, I should stop, or who keeps cheating on his wife despite telling himself, oh, I should not do it, she deserves better, or whatever, or who keeps getting aggressive, keeps getting into fights, despite telling himself, oh, I should restrain myself, I should not always get so angry. And then next would be the state of nature. How could we form an analogy between the juridical state of nature and a similar state in ethics? Well, it would have to be a state where you have freedom, but neither law nor force, right? So you have the freedom to do whatever you want, but you have no autonomy. That is, you don't think about what you should do. And this is probably the state that most people are in. This is the state that the non-moral people are generally in. And of course, in that state, you will use your freedom to just follow your drives and instincts, right? So you will just be selfish, probably. You will just be hedonistic, doing whatever you feel like doing, following every whim. The difference between the person I discussed previously, so the difference to ethical anarchy, would be that you probably do it without bad conscience, right? The person I just discussed does think about what he should do, and he does come probably to the right conclusion. He just isn't virtuous enough. He just doesn't have the power of will to also force himself to do it. And therefore he would probably feel bad, because again and again he would end up doing things that he himself tells himself are wrong and shouldn't be done. But now, if you have a situation with freedom without law or force, you would have a person that doesn't feel bad about following his drives, about being selfish, about possibly hurting others. But just like when it comes to right, in ethics also, freedom, only freedom, without law or force, is hardly possible, could hardly remain, right? I mean, in the juridical state of nature, since everyone is free, others could use force to take your freedom away, and you need force to maybe protect it. Well, when we look at the individual, when we are thinking about ethics, if you only have freedom and you only follow your whims and drives, you will also soon lose your freedom, right? Because then you might not feel like getting up early in the morning, but then you will probably lose your job. Or you might feel like taking all sorts of drugs, but then you will end up addicted, right? So for that reason, even the person who does not recognize any law, be it the actual moral law that he as an autonomous being gave himself, or be it in the case of heteronomy, in the case of ethical despotism, some wrong, only allegedly moral law that others talked him into believing. No, even the person who does not recognize any law will probably have to force himself a bit, like forcing himself to get up early in the morning, or forcing himself to not punch the guy in the face that he dislikes, because that would have negative consequences. So indeed, that would be the state of most most people who are not morally good, right? They have freedom and they have some measure of self-discipline, if they are not being completely stupid and self-destructive, but they do not recognize a law. And lastly, we could ask, is there an analogy for barbarism in the field of ethics? Again, barbarism would be the rule of force alone without law or freedom. It would be sheer violence, the strong ruling over the weak. Well, if we apply this to ethics, where the force is autocracy, where the force is you forcing yourself, then this would have to be a situation where you have some sort of self-discipline. You force yourself into certain actions, so much so even that you take your freedom away, but you do not do it in order to force yourself to follow a law. Not the proper moral law that you gave yourself, and not even an incorrect moral law that maybe your church or your sect or your party, your ideological group taught you. And I think indeed there are such situations where people show some measure of self-discipline, but not to follow some law. Think of people with eating disorders, for example. Like think of someone who is anorexic, who will probably have some measure of self-discipline, forcing themselves to not eat, but not because they think that this is generally the moral thing to do, or because their church or whatever told them that they should do it, but rather this is some arbitrary individual choice, right? Or likewise, people who are super obsessed with working out, with going to the gym, like these guys who want to be alpha guys, right? Who constantly who do nothing else, to the point it's an obsession or an addiction. They too probably exercise some sort of self-discipline, but in the name of something completely arbitrary, not in the name of something. Not even they themselves would say that this is a universal law, that everyone should have to do that. So this, you could say, is barbarism in the ethical sphere. This is, so to say, self-barbarism. You violating yourself, taking your own freedom away and not doing it in any lawful manner. But anyways, those were my own thoughts. Again, Kant does not go so far. He does not think his analogy through that much. But I think if you do think it through, that would be the result. But let's go back into the sphere of rights. Let's go back to Kant himself, who once again says that the rational state, the republic, should have freedom, law, and force. And there are various possibilities of what could go wrong, of one or two of these elements lacking. Now, this can be quite helpful in several regards. For one, it can help you better understand Kant's concept of freedom. I already discussed that in the lecture, What is Freedom? That to Kant, there are two types of freedom. On the one hand, there is a completely unrestricted freedom, a freedom without the law, which, when we are talking in juridical terms, Kant would call the brutal freedom. Brutal here, however, does not mean cruel. Nowadays, of course, when we hear of brutality, we think of cruelty, which is true not only in English, the same is true in modern day German. But back in his day, the word was used more in the original sense of being animalistic, animal like. So when Kant says brutal freedom, he does not mean that it is necessarily cruel, but he's saying that this is a freedom like the freedom of animals who have no laws. He also calls it the nomadic freedom, because this is the freedom that nomadic people have. Or he calls it the wild or the savage freedom. There's no difference in German, right? Because in English, it seems that you use wild more for nature, like wild animals. But for human beings, you would rather use the term savage. But English, of course, has these two roots, right? The Germanic root, where the word wild comes from, and then the Romanic root, so the Latin root coming from French, which is where the word savage comes from. In German, there's only one word. There's only the word wild. So Kant says wilde Freiheit. So wild freedom, literally, but you could also translate it with savage freedom. And then on the other hand, to Kant, there is the freedom under the law, the freedom that is somewhat restricted through the law, which in the case of the juridical freedom, Kant would call civil or civilized freedom. And the point, as I explained further in that earlier lecture on freedom, the point to Kant is that you need to restrict freedom through a law, because while that may seem contradictory or paradoxical for a moment, it makes perfect sense, because only this way can you actually protect freedom. Otherwise, the completely unrestricted freedom ends up destroying itself, right? This is true in the field of ethics, where, sure, as an individual you can do whatever you want, but as I already said, if you are free to, for example, take drugs or simply lead a very unhealthy lifestyle, that will end up destroying your freedom. So you should restrict your freedom through a rational law. You should follow, for example, the duties towards yourself, which I also discussed in a previous lecture, in order to retain your freedom. But it is equally true in the field of arts, where genius to Kant means originality. The genius artist is original, sure, but he would say that the artist should restrict the freedom of his genius, of his ideas somewhat, by the rules of good taste. That is, he should produce an original product, sure, but that original artwork should still have a form that is tasteful, because taste is that ability to choose what is liked not only by you in your particularity, but what is liked by everyone. And a completely unrestricted genius will create grotesque, tasteless things that might be very original, but no one would like these artworks, and therefore they would not have any success. They would not speak to the people. And likewise in thinking. in thinking, sure, you can give yourself freedom to think whatever you want, to think up all sorts of nonsense, to get lost in conspiracy theories, or to get lost in superstitions, or in raving, but that would actually end up destroying the freedom of thinking, right? If you believe in superstitions and demons and magic and whatever, then you cannot really understand the world anymore, and you cannot really so understand in the sense of natural science, understanding the laws that nature functions by. And you can then not do anything with the world, right? You cannot employ those laws to create technology to deal with the world. So it would be best to, and that is what Kant tries to do in his main work, in his critique of pure reason, to self-restrict the freedom of your thinking, to tell yourself to not think up anything that you can think of, but rather to stick to that which you can actually have cognition of, that is, to stick to experience. Not the thinkable, but the thing that can also be experienced. Because that actually saves the freedom of your thinking. So this is true in all areas, and it is obviously also true in the area of right. Here, if we have the state of nature, sure, we have unrestricted freedom, no law, but as I already said, freedom alone might be possible amongst angels. It's not possible amongst humans. This will probably lead to force, to people using force, using violence on one another, and it will probably end in barbarism. It will probably end in the violent rule of the strong. So therefore, Kant would say, it is better to restrict freedom through laws. That is, it is better to leave the state of nature and have a proper state. Of course, the laws should not be too restrictive, otherwise you would have despotism. They should be laws that protect freedom, and then you have the republic, where you have freedom, law, and force, right? So otherwise, everyone can have the freedom to kill one another. Well, if I'm killed, I lose quite a bit of freedom, right? Or otherwise, everyone can have the freedom to fly around, fly on vacation as much as they want. But well, when we have a climate breakdown, that will take quite a bit of our freedom. Which, by the way, also goes to show that our current states that we have don't have proper laws. They don't have laws that restrict freedom as is necessary in order to protect freedom. But this is Kant's great insight. Freedom destroys itself if it is wild or savage or brutal freedom. It needs to be civil freedom that is put under a law. Now, of course, the issue, however, is that nowadays, in our ausgeklärt age of great liberalism and individualism, more than ever before, probably, people, when they hear the word law, they are automatically against it, right? All they hear is restriction. All they hear is freedom being taken away from them. That law can actually give them freedom is an alien thought to them. To them, law is something tyrannical. So, for example, here in Germany, the political discourse the past years, past 1 or 2 decades, there's been a lot of talk about Verbotspolitik, politics of prohibition. And this is an evil word, right? Whenever someone suggests some sort of restriction, then you have others, usually on the right, screaming about Verbotspolitik. And no one wants to deal with that label. So, including the leftists, including the Green Party, that is accused of Verbotspolitik the most, they are very afraid of that accusation. Of course, it's completely stupid. I am for politics of prohibition. I think it's good that, for example, murder is prohibited or rape is prohibited. I want those things to be prohibited. Again, of course, there shouldn't be too much prohibition. Otherwise, you have despotism. But if you have no prohibition, you have no laws, then you have the state of nature, and that can only end in barbarism. So, yes, the state should prohibit whatever is harmful to freedom. But we don't want that, right? So, Germany is pretty much almost the only state on earth where there is no speed limit on the highways. And for so many years now, there have been discussions about this, how it would be better to have a speed limit, both for environmental climate reasons and also to simply prevent car crashes, prevent accidents. But people or certain parties, the Liberal Party, the Conservatives, the Nazi Party, of course, irrationally reject that as prohibition politics. And what to the German is his car, to the American is his gun, right? There you have the same thing. It is pretty much every other normal civilized state has restrictions on private gun ownership, because why should people own means to kill each other? Why should the state not have the monopoly of power? But despite people again and again being killed in accidents or in school shootings, whenever a law is suggested that could change this, a law to restrict the freedom to own guns, but in order to actually keep and secure freedom, the freedom to stay alive, you have people hearing law, hearing restriction, and getting hysterical because they think their freedom is being taken away, right? And this is always the case. I mean, it's the same with, for example, the freedom to kill each other out of revenge, blood revenge, right? There are still areas in the world, and even here in Europe, like in Albania, where families insist on their right to take blood revenge, to kill someone from another family if someone from that family has killed someone from theirs, right? And when the state tries to prohibit murder, they think that this takes their freedom away. Or likewise, you had, once again in the US, you had a whole civil war being fought over this, right? And the central government wanted to restrict the people's freedom somewhat, that is, the freedom to own slaves, in order to actually protect freedom, that is, the freedom of those people who otherwise might be enslaved. But then the southern states rebelled against that. They rebelled to retain some of their wild freedom, that is, to retain the freedom to keep slaves. of course, nowadays you have these revisionists amongst the right-wingers who will say, oh no, it was not about slavery and racism, it was about states' rights, about the rights of the states to make their own decisions and to not have the central government interfere with that. But I always find that funny because, I mean, it's true in a sense, right? It was about these states' rights to make their own decisions. But then if you press on and ask, okay, states' rights to what? Like, what freedom did they want to retain? What matter did they not want to leave to the central government, but wanted to decide for themselves? Well, it was the freedom to decide whether slavery should be legal or not, right? So the issue is that people simply, if you present them with a law that is simply rational, there can be no rational argument against prohibiting slavery or prohibiting blood revenge or prohibiting unlimited speeding on the highways or prohibiting private gun ownership. Like, no rational person would ever want these things. Everyone who is rational would say, yes, these things should not be done, so let's prohibit them. But all people hear is, oh, some of our freedom is being taken away. They don't understand that freedom is being taken away in order to protect freedom. And this is true in the juridical sphere. This is also true in all other spheres, right? Like in art, when someone thinks he is oh so genius with his art and oh so original, he doesn't want to hear that this is tasteless and maybe he should stick to somewhat classical, tasteful forms. He would say, oh, you are just restricting my genius. You are just some Philistine who doesn't get it. And it's probably worst in the ethical sphere. This is why morality has become a bad word. People don't want to hear about morality because whenever you talk to them about a moral law, to them there's no difference between actual ethics, actual autonomy, and ethical despotism. That is someone else, like some church, for example, forcing some law onto me from the outside, trying to talk me into having a bad conscience. So when you tell somebody what you're doing there is immoral, like maybe you should not shop there, you should not take part in this capitalistic consumer society and the global exploitation and the global destruction of the climate, or you should not support such states, you should not support China or Muscovy or the Emirates or Israel that commit unjust acts. All that person usually hears is, oh, someone arrogantly wants to tell me what to do. Despite me being an adult, they are interfering with my life. They are, being despotic, telling me what I should do. Who is that other person to tell me what I should do? And to be sure, we can admit that this is even somewhat justified. Morality should be based on autonomy. We are all equal. So it would indeed be arrogant and presumptuous for one human being to tell another what to do. And we can admit that a lot of alleged or seeming moralizing is just that. Is just people trying to establish some sort of ethical despotism. And that's done by the left and the right, right? The left will try to tell people how to talk, not to use certain bad words, or the left will try to tell people to not do certain things, not dress certain ways, because that's cultural appropriation, right? A white person cannot have dreadlocks because that's cultural appropriation. That's, of course, ethical despotism. So the right who complains about this woke despotism is certainly no better when they try to tell people, for example, to not be gay, to not have premarital sex or whatever, like when they try to restrict people's sexuality and people's happiness in that way. But it is different if someone is not just trying to be an ethical despot, trying to tell others what to do, but rather trying to get them to tell themselves what to do. So when I'm addressing someone's conscience, when I'm saying to someone, well, think about what you're doing here, and think about whether you yourself can really condone that. Think about whether you would want for this to be done by everyone, for this to become a universal law, or if you yourself would like others to act in a different way and are just making an exception for yourself. That sort of moralizing is not presumptuous and is not an attack on another's freedom. But people, the unaufclared people, they don't understand that true freedom is not following every whim you have. Quite the contrary. That is not freedom. That means being a slave to your desires, to your urges, to your drives, to your addictions. They don't understand that true freedom lies in having a character. I already gave an earlier lecture on what Kant has to say about character. That true freedom lies precisely in thinking about what should be done. Not following your desire to do a certain thing, but using your reason to think about what would be good, and then sticking to that, following your insight. True freedom is not a drug addict getting his drugs. True freedom would be if he, through reason, understands that the drugs are bad, and if he could follow this understanding of him. But that is where. That already requires a great measure of Aufklärung. The unaufkläred people have this almost this instinctive hatred of the law, Kant would say, of any sort of law, no matter how rational it is. And this hatred of the law he calls barbaric. Right? So these are barbarians to him. Barbarians are people that reject the law, that fight against the law that you try to impose on them. Right? So it's a difference between the savage and the barbarian. The savage, like some tribesman from a small tribe, maybe, the savage lives in the state of nature without laws, has only freedom, doesn't know of any laws. But if you suggest to the savage to submit to laws, if you try to give the savage laws, and then he rejects that, then he actually fights against those laws, then he turns into a barbarian. So barbaric people are those that fight against laws being imposed on them, and you can fight throughout history that people are always barbarians. Whenever a new law is imposed, it is usually a struggle. Usually there are lots of forces, no matter how rational that law is, fighting against that. So let's say, for example, in Kant's day, it was still normal, at least in certain social classes, amongst the nobility, amongst the higher bourgeoisie, to duel, right? If you felt that someone had attacked your honor, you asked him to duel you, and the state at some point tried to outlaw that, but for the longest time, the certain social classes insisted, like the nobility, once again, the army officers, insisted on keeping dueling each other. Now, of course, that is the freedom to duel, to defend your honor, that actually threatens freedom because you might be killed in the process. And there's also this social coercion, right? If you live in such a society and someone challenges you to a duel, you sort of have to accept. Otherwise, it means social death. Otherwise, everyone will treat you as having no honor. So really, duels being outlawed gave us freedom. But still, people fought against it, and for the longest time. I mean, the first German chancellor, the guy who united Germany, Bismarck, he still dueled, even with the knowledge of his king, while it was already outlawed, and still this had no consequences for him. And I even know a story of my dad who studied in the 70s. Of some old professor at his university, in some university meeting, for some reason, for something, some other professor had said, getting mad at that professor and challenging him to a duel. Now the other professor did not accept, but this professor who did this, I mean, this was the 70s. He was probably an old professor, probably old school. So, meaning, like, if we assume that he himself was 70, maybe, then he had been born before the First World War, then he had been born in the German Empire. So, he was probably still raised with these old school values. And this goes to show how long this stuck around, and how much people did not accept these laws that outlawed that. But even when it comes to the smallest things, like here in Germany in past decades, at some point they passed a law requiring you to wear a seatbelt in the car for safety measures, right? Because in car crashes, lots of people got injured or died. And so now it is required. And if police spot you not wearing a seatbelt, they are gonna stop you in your car. People fought against that, tooth and nail. Or likewise, some time ago, they passed a law that in normal restaurants you cannot smoke anymore. So now the smokers have to take a break and go outside if they want to smoke. Again, people fought against that. And the point with these things is that afterwards, after the law has passed and has been enforced for a while, and this has been normalized, no one complains anymore. And no one can imagine going back. Like, even the smokers are totally fine nowadays with not being able to smoke in restaurants. Like 20 years ago, the restaurants, if you stepped in, you stepped into this big cloud of smoke. It was terrible. For the people sitting there, of course, even more so for the waiters working there, no one wants to go back there. But even though afterward, everyone understands that it was actually an improvement, at first, people fought against that. And they never learn. It's never, hey, we fought against this one law, but it turned out to be an improvement, so maybe we should not fight against this new law so much. But it's always the same story, right? Like now you have people fighting against all sorts of environmental measures. For example, people fighting against restrictions in the cities for cars, against cities becoming more pedestrian friendly, or maybe even becoming car free, right? I mean, there are even conspiracy theories that the 15-minute city where you can reach everything you need, the grocery store, the physician, the school, by a 15 minutes walk, that this is somehow a conspiracy to take away our freedom, to, I don't know, erect walls so that we can only walk these 15 minutes and not go further. I mean, it is so clearly better to have a city where you can reach everything in 15 minutes and where you can actually be out on the street, and children can play on the street, and people can sit around there or meet, or where it's less loud and where the air is better. I mean, once this becomes a reality, and I mean, there are already places that are ahead of us, right? Paris is working on becoming car free. Barcelona has these super blocks where you have certain blocks of houses between which cars cannot drive. Once this becomes a reality, it is absolutely clear that people will see, oh, this is much better. Why haven't we done this sooner? And that people will not want to go back. But now, while it is not a reality yet, people are fighting against it. And it is for this very reason, this inherent barbarism of the unaufklärt people, this irrational hatred of the law, thinking that every law takes away your freedom, and not understanding that a good, a rational, a just law actually protects freedom and gives you freedom. It is for this reason that progress is so slow. All of human history, to Kant, I will discuss this further when I get to his anthropology, and then I will talk about his philosophy of history. But to him, the actual real cosmopolitan history is the history of the progress of justice, the progress of right, and therefore of getting from the lawless and warlike state of nature to a state of perpetual peace. And in theory, this could be done in a day, right? In theory, in the state of nature, all people could come together, agree on a social contract with just laws, and establish a rational republic. But actually, this is something that takes a long, long time. Hundreds and thousands and maybe tens of thousands of years. And this is just because of this barbaric hatred of the law. This is the reason why Kant would probably say it's more likely that from the state of nature we first enter the barbaric state, right? So the state of nature where you have only freedom, force arises, and the force eventually destroys freedom, and then you have the rule of the strong over the weak. And then maybe from barbarism eventually you get to despotism, because the strong ruler maybe establish some laws, and at first they will be unjust laws, they will be oppressive laws, but at least they will be some laws, and they will somewhat restrict the arbitrary barbaric rule. And then maybe from despotism you will slowly get to a republic. That is, slowly the laws will become more just, less restrictive, more allowing to freedom. But this may take millennia, because at every single stage people will irrationally protest and fight like little children that don't want to brush their teeth against even the most rational law. And Kant also makes the, I think, psychologically quite wide remark that, well, people don't want a state of nature. Like, they don't want a completely unrestricted freedom where everyone can do whatever they want, including harming them, including taking their freedom away. So people would like some sort of law, but only for the others. What people always want is not complete lawlessness. What they want is lawfulness, but with an exception for themselves. They would like for themselves to be the only people to not be restricted by the law. Now, as much, however, as this inherent barbarism that holds human progress back and that is so unaufklärt, this hatred for the law, should be criticized, we also need to admit that, of course, a law as such is not necessarily a good thing, and that, of course, some distrust towards the law or some unwillingness not to submit to laws in general, but to submit to certain laws is very much justified. Because, let's remember, to Kant, there's not just a difference between the state of nature, where you have freedom and eventually also force will arise and even take the freedom away, leading to barbarism, but also no law. There's not just a difference between that state of nature and, on the other hand, a state where you do have a law and force that enforces that law, so not the state of anarchy. But rather, here too, you have two different possibilities. You can have the proper republic, where law and force do not take away but rather protect freedom. But you can also have the despotic state, where the law and the force enforcing it do take away freedom. And that leads to the question, how do we know? How do we know which law is a proper law? How do we know what is a just law? One that protects and doesn't take away freedom. And Kant would say the law that is just should be one that is not arbitrary, that was not simply given by some person's choice. And it doesn't really matter if that person is really just one person, one singular dictator, or whether it's a majority of people. Like, dictatorship by the majority is really not better than dictatorship by a single individual. No, the law should not be the arbitrary product of a choice that imposes it on others, but rather the law should come from reason itself. That is, it should be a law that people could have given themselves, right? So ethics to Kant is based on autonomy. Here, there is no legislator outside of me. I am my own legislator. I use my own reason to ask what would be good, what should be done, and then I make myself act accordingly. While the right, on the other hand, has an outer legislator, so there is no actual autonomy, there is heteronomy. But the condition to Kant is still that this heteronomy should be as if it was autonomy. So the legislator outside of me should only impose laws on me that maybe I have not given myself because I'm not a good or a rational person, but that I could have given myself if I was a rational person. And this is what leads us back to this idea of the social contract. of people in the state of nature coming together to agree what laws there should be, to together erect a state. Kant says this social contract is, of course, a historical fiction. This is not how it worked. Again, if it was how it worked, we would have immediately entered the perfect republic. How it worked more likely is probably that force was used, that we didn't enter the republic right away, but rather we entered first barbarism, the strongest subjugating the weaker ones. So Kant is aware that this is fiction, but still, to him it is important. He says it may not be the historical principle of the origin of the state, but the idea of the social contract should be the rational principle of administrating and of judging the state and its laws. Meaning, it should have the same function that, according to Kant, all ideas have. This is something I have discussed in the lecture on what is reason, because reason to Kant is the faculty of ideas. And ideas to Kant are concepts of reason that are about something absolute, some sort of maximum, right? They are not like the concepts of the intellect. The intellect may have concepts of empirical things like house or dog or tree or whatever. And these help us make experience. That is, they help us understand what we find in the world. The ideas, the concepts of reason, because they are always about some sort of maximum, but in experience we can only find relative things, we can only find limited things, not an absolute, not a maximum. For that reason, we cannot find anything that corresponds to an idea in the world, right? So we have the idea of justice or of wisdom or of holiness. We will never find a completely just state or a person that is fully wise, that is a true sage, or a truly holy person that is completely good without any vices. But still, Kant says the ideas are not simply chimeras, that is, they are not empty concepts that mean nothing and that we should just forget about, but rather, while they may not help in understanding what is there, they can work as as measurements, as examples, and as yardsticks. So we can use the ideas both to judge what is there and to set a goal for ourselves to strive for. So you can use the idea of holiness, for example, to judge a person. You can compare an individual to your idea that you have of holiness, and then you can see how close he comes to it, so how good or how bad he may be. And you can also use this idea as something to strive for, right? Like certain Christians may do when they ask, what would Jesus do? That is really the question, what would a completely holy person do, right? Because that's what they imagine Jesus as. Doesn't matter so much whether they are right to do so, whether the historical Jesus was completely holy, but they are imagining him as such, and so they are really asking, what would be the holy, what would be the good thing to do here? And well, the same, Kant says, is true for the idea of the social contract. The state might not have originated through such a social contract, but we can still use it and ask ourselves, if this had been the origin of the state, could this specific law that we are dealing with here then be a law in that case? That is, could this have been a law that everyone agreed on in this original contract? And that idea is so important to judging and to administrating the state, that Kant says, and of course he still lives in the 18th century, so in the age of absolutism, that the princes should be raised with that idea, being prepared to eventually lead their states as kings. They should learn to judge by that idea. And of course, absolutism might be over. We might nowadays have democracy. But that doesn't change the general statement, right? It just means that the person being raised to rule is not just one single prince, but rather it means that every child is eventually going to become a ruler, or at least a co-ruler of the state. And that would mean that the schools should prepare them, amongst other things, by teaching them this idea of the original social contract and of judging by it, which of course isn't done, right? I mean, nowadays democracy is not simply a form of rulership. It has turned into some sort of ideology where people seem to think that simply having democracy, simply having the ability for everyone to vote, is in itself good and just, and that people don't need to be prepared. So, I mean, no one would think like that if we were dealing with monarchy. Everyone would say, yeah, the prince should not become king completely unprepared, but ideally, if one person is eventually going to hold all the power, that person should be prepared for it. That person should have some sort of education that turns him into a responsible and just ruler. Well, why should the same not be true in a democracy, when not just one person is the ruler, but everyone is? But that's not what we are doing, or even trying to do. Our modern schools, they don't try to raise proper citizens to take part in the shared polity. That's maybe what education tried to do in an ancient Greek city-state, but certainly not our education. Our education, if anything, tries to prepare job holders. It tries to prepare people for the job market, for taking part in the economy, but it does not really try to prepare them for taking part in the polity. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of social science, of political classes here and there, but really there's no systematic attempt to turn people into responsible co-rulers, into responsible citizens. It is as if we think it's fine to just let them turn 18 and then just give them all the rights, give them the right to vote, and somehow this will turn out fine. Well, I think we currently can see that it does not turn out fine. But anyways, to Kant, the point with this idea is that we should ask ourselves, whoever's in charge, be it the one monarch or be it all the people in democracy, we should ask ourselves, is this law a law that everyone could have agreed to? Not necessarily that everyone agrees to. People might be irrational, people might be evil, people might want to make exceptions for themselves. But if we imagine they were in the state of nature and they wanted to leave it because it's a state of permanent insecurity, of permanent potential war, and they came together to form a contract and agree on the laws, could they then have agreed on these laws? And only if the answer is yes, are these laws just. So if we ask ourselves, is it just that murder is not allowed, that our freedom to murder each other is taken away, then we can clearly see yes, because everyone could have agreed to that, right? In the state of nature, I live in constant danger of maybe my neighbor killing me. So I could say to my neighbor, lay down your weapon, promise not to kill me, and in return, I promise not to kill you and to lay down my weapon. And clearly, this is something the neighbor, who also lives in constant danger of being killed by me, could have agreed on. But let's, on the other hand, take apartheid laws, for example. Doesn't matter which ones. So the apartheid of Jim Crow in the US, the apartheid of the Nuremberg laws under the Nazis, which of course doesn't usually get called that, but of course this was apartheid against the Jews. The apartheid in South Africa, the current apartheid in Israel against the Palestinians, or if you take Afghanistan under the Taliban, which people have described and defined as gender apartheid. Doesn't matter. The question is, could everyone have agreed to that? Now, of course, the Nazis came to power in an already existing state. They were voted into power, and then they just had to change the laws. And of course, the Jews could not do much about it. The Jews were a very small minority. Less than 1% of the German population were Jews. Somehow, despite the Germans allegedly being the master race, they were still threatened by such a small percentage of Jews. I mean, even if the Jews were parasites like the Nazis claimed, if a being so big as me gets bitten by a mosquito and the mosquito sucks out one droplet of blood, I mean, maybe it gets a bit itchy, but it doesn't really threaten me. I'm not gonna die, right? If one mosquito bite kills me, that probably means I'm somehow weak. That's not something that should happen to the master race. But that aside, the Nazis came to power in an already existing state, and there's nothing the Jews could do about it. But if we imagine there had been no German state, there had been the state of nature, and now people would come together, and now they would debate what laws to establish. And the Nazis would say to the Jews, okay, you should lay down your weapons. You should promise not to kill any of us Germans. But in return, we will make no such promises. When you are completely defenseless, we will take away all your freedoms, and eventually we will kill you. Now, why would the Jews have agreed to that? They might not like the state of nature. Maybe they would prefer entering a state, but certainly not such a state. To such a state, the state of nature is preferable, right? They would probably have said, well, I don't like the insecurity. I don't like being constantly threatened in the state of nature, but I would rather keep my weapons and my ability to maybe defend myself and maybe kill you, rather than completely making myself defenseless, right? Same with slavery. If all the people had come together, the white people, the black people, and the white people had said, okay, you black people, you should make the promise not to kill us, not to steal from us, you should promise to work for us and to follow our orders. and in return we promise you nothing. We retain the ability to kill you, to whip you, to rape you. Then again, the black people would probably say, well, in that case, I would rather remain in the state of nature, where you might still attack me, and still you might overwhelm me and bind me, and then whip me or rape me or kill me, enslave me. But at least I can try to fight you. At least I can try to defend myself. Why should I be defenseless against you? So, for that reason, everyone would have to agree that such apartheid laws or slavery or whatever is unjust. Even the biggest racist, the biggest Nazi, the biggest Zionist, the biggest Taliban, whoever, would have to agree that his laws, that whatever system he is imposing on people, is not something that everyone could agree to. It's not something that his own victims could agree to. They might say, I don't care. Like the Nazis would say, probably, this might be unjust, but universal justice is a Jewish idea anyways, that you got brainwashed with. We don't care about justice. Nature is eternal fight of survival of the fittest, and there is no justice, there's only the rule of the strong. And the Zionist or the Taliban would maybe say, oh, this is a higher sort of justice. Justice is actually not established by everyone agreeing. People don't get to decide what is just. Rather, justice depends on alleged commandments of God. And if God says that this land was gifted to the Jews, or that women should have no rights, then this is just by definition because it comes from God, even if all people on earth disagreed with it. So they can give such answers, of course, but even they would have to admit that clearly not everyone could agree to their laws. Maybe they don't care about that, but they would have to agree that the only way their laws can be in place is not through universal consensus between all the people who are governed by these laws, but only through force and subjugation. These laws can only be in place because they are forced upon people, whether the people like it or not. And so you can only rule with these laws, not because they are just, but because you happen to be the stronger one. And to Kant, it clearly shows that these laws are unjust. You can only demand that someone leaves the state of nature, where he has his own force, where he can at least try to protect himself, that someone disarms, so to say. You can only demand that if you can offer him something in return, if you can offer actual security and freedom. Otherwise, you cannot make that demand, right? So that's the situation, for example, that we see in Palestine, right? That is why that situation is so unjust. I mean, if it was the way that the Zionist propaganda presents it, right? Oh yeah, sure, Israel would have liked to make peace, but the Palestinians never wanted to make peace from the first moment on. They are the irrational anti-Semites who just want to drive all Jews into the sea. That would be one thing. But of course, that's not a real situation. It's just propaganda. And of course, the reality is that the Palestinians are demanded to leave the state of nature, right? Because right now, the Palestinians, maybe not the ones that are citizens of Israel, but certainly the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, they live with the Israelis in the state of nature. Both groups may not have the state of nature amongst themselves. So clearly in Israel there are laws. The Israelis amongst one another don't live in the state of nature. But they do live in the state of nature with the Palestinians, right? Meaning if the Israeli steps into the West Bank, there are no proper laws. The Israeli can just shoot a Palestinian randomly, and it will probably not have any consequences. And on the other hand, of course, a Palestinian can also go and stab an Israeli. But now the point is that the Palestinians are demanded to leave the state of nature and to enter some sort of civil state, to submit to some sort of law. I mean, that is, for example, what people condemning the 7th of October demand, right? The 7th of October happened in a state of nature, in a state of lawlessness. And people who condemn it are basically saying, well, the Palestinians should submit to a law. They, like people who say Hamas should disarm, are basically saying they should submit to a law that prohibits them from killing Israelis. And that demand as such is not an unjust demand. But the issue is that it is a one-sided demand, right? They are not promised anything in return. It's not okay, they should accept the rights of the Israelis, and in return the Israelis should accept their rights. And again, this is what right is about. It is about the mine and yours, about everyone getting guaranteed what is his. But rather, this is one side saying you must accept what is ours, but there is nothing that is yours that we would leave to you and guarantee you as yours. Not even the small piece of land left to you after 80% of your land was actually already taken. Not even that you get as a state. But still, we rather retain the right for ourselves to settle on your land wherever we want, to drive you away. But you should not have any right, on the other hand, to attack us, to drive us away. That is terrorism. That is clearly unjust. And you can see that such laws are not laws that everyone could agree to, because indeed the Palestinians don't agree to it. Palestinians like Hamas are gonna say, well, in that case, we would rather stay in the state of nature. We would rather stay armed and keep attacking you. That might not be ideal. That might not be what we actually want. But it is clearly better than simply one-sided submission. And Kant would say you cannot demand that somebody guarantees you your right and accepts your right unless you also guarantee him his rights. And so this is this idea of the social contract. This is the basic principle by which to judge everything, every law, right? The question is always, could everyone have agreed to that? And through that you can solve many legal issues, many questions. Is this just or not? For example, through this you can reject utilitarianism that tries to sacrifice people, right? So after 9/11, This was part of the public debate. Here in Germany, they tried to pass a law that would have allowed it to shoot down an airplane if it was hijacked by terrorists before maybe it is flown into a stadium or something, even if there are hostages on that airplane. But the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, said no, this is unconstitutional, because our constitution, which is influenced by Kant, starts with saying that the dignity of human beings cannot be violated, and this clearly would be against the dignity, because if you ask, is this a law that everyone could agree to, then, well, maybe the majority could agree to it. Maybe all the people in the stadium that might die if the plane hits the stadium could agree to it. But the hostages on the plane could not, certainly not agree to simply be sacrificed in order to save others. So this is not any such law that says it is okay for the state to sacrifice some people for the greater good, is not a law that everyone could have agreed to. It is a law that maybe can be enforced because the majority is simply more powerful, because if the majority decides to sacrifice a minority, there's not much the minority can do about it. But then again, you have rule by mere force. Then again, you have a despotic law that is simply enforced by the supreme power of the state, but you don't have a just law, because a just law would be one that everyone can agree to. And to be clear, people could voluntarily risk their lives for the state. So let's say the state is attacked by a hostile army, then a law that says that there is conscription, that everyone has to fight in the army to protect the state, would not be an unjust law. Because if people have a state that guarantees their security, their freedom, their property, presumably they would want the state to keep existing. And if it is attacked, they might agree to a law that forces them to protect that state and its laws, even if they are risking their lives. But while that is not an unjust law, a law that demands that people lose their lives, so that they actually be sacrificed, that they not just risk their lives, but really simply give it away, simply accept being killed, that is not a law that can ever be just. Because the whole reason why I would be willing to risk my life for the state is because I want to keep my freedom, right? Because in this state I'm free, because this state has just laws. But if it's not just risking my life, but actively giving it away, why would I agree to that? I mean, the other people who are not being sacrificed might benefit from that, but I'm not benefiting. So in that case, I have no reason to agree to that. So that, to Kant, is the principle by which to judge the justice of a law. Could everyone have potentially agreed to that? Now, this leads me to the last major point, and to what is probably the best part of Kant's philosophy of right. And that is what he calls the maxim of publicity. This is a test. This maxim of publicity, at points he also calls it the principle of truth. This is a test we can use to see if a particular action, a particular maxim, a particular law is just. Kant calls it an experiment of reason that we can undertake. And he also calls it transcendental principle of reason. Transcendental, what that means, I discussed in more detail in my lecture on transcendental idealism, but here it's enough to say that it is the opposite of empirical. So this principle is transcendental because it does not require any experience. That is, we don't have to look at the world and how the world functions, but rather we can use reason alone. And a priori, that is precisely before any experience, through this principle, we can determine whether something is just or unjust. What is this principle? Well, the maxim of publicity simply asks, could a given maxim, action, law, could it stand publicity? So if it became public, if my intention was known, what would happen? Because after all, we are dealing here with the public law, right? The public right is precisely about laws that need to be publicized and publicly enforced. And again, at least the fiction that we are working with, even though historically it might not be true, is that everyone came together in a sort of public assembly and publicly discussed what laws there should be and agreed on the same laws. And since the question is, when we ask, is a law just? Since the question is, could everyone have agreed to that law? Well, we might as well ask, could this law be public? Right? Because if it is not public, then of course you don't need everyone to agree to it. If you keep something hidden from people, you can do it without their agreement. But as soon as you make it public, if they don't agree with it, then they might interfere with your actions. So let's say you are asking yourself if murder is just. Let's say you are a wannabe murderer and you just put poison into someone's food. Well, simply ask yourself, could my action stand publicity? So what if I told this person while handing him the food, I just poisoned your food, I'm planning to kill you? Well, even the murderer would have to agree that this would kind of defeat the purpose. The person would probably not eat the food. Or likewise, let's say you're a thief and you are on the street and you are trying to take someone's purse or someone's phone from their pocket. Well, again, ask yourself, what if you made this public? What if you loudly announced, hey, I'm about to pull your phone from your pocket? Well, again, it would probably defeat your purpose. The person would probably not let you do it. And so Kant says, if a maxim that you have cannot stand publicity, if it would destroy itself necessarily by becoming public, because again, it is a maxim that maybe you yourself agree with, and maybe some other people would agree with, but not everyone would agree with. And therefore you cannot want for everyone to know it, then this maxim is unjust. And by this we can judge laws, right? So let's say that the Nazis, before coming to power, had been completely honest about what they are going to do. Then maybe they would not even have risen to power, because maybe the people who were against the Nazis, like the Social Democrats and the communists in Germany who spent more time fighting each other, maybe they would have put up more serious opposition if they had known that the Nazis were even gonna start a new world war and commit a genocide. And maybe some other people, some somewhat conservative, somewhat right-wing people who even supported the Nazis, would not have done so if they had known how far the Nazis would go. But even if the Nazis had risen to power, if they had announced right away, yeah, we are going to commit genocide against the Jews, then maybe the Jews would have left right away in 1933. While in reality, many states thinking, oh, it's not gonna be that bad. We can deal with that, with a little bit of discrimination and oppression. So by announcing the intention to commit genocide, the Nazis would have made the genocide impossible, maybe, for themselves. Likewise, if they had announced right away that they plan a new war, I mean, the whole appeasement politics of the UK and of France would probably not have happened. They would probably not have let the Nazis get away with rearming and with annexing Austria and the Sudetenland and destroying Czechoslovakia. They would probably have intervened sooner when the Nazis were not as powerful yet, and thereby prevented a full-on world war. So the whole thing really depended on their dishonesty. And the same in our days, right? I mean, Putin could not have attacked Ukraine like that if he had been honest. I mean, if even before suddenly annexing the Crimea, he would have announced this plan, then maybe the Western powers would have acted sooner, or even earlier. In the 90s, Ukraine had nuclear weapons, old Soviet nuclear weapons that had been stationed in Ukraine, and they agreed to get rid of them in return for Moscow guaranteeing the borders. Well, if back then Moscow had said, yeah, no, we are just lying, we are gonna wait for you to get rid of the nuclear weapons, and then some years later we are gonna attack you, then probably Ukraine would have just kept those weapons. So again, if an action is only possible through keeping it hidden, through being deceitful, if it would not be possible, if it would defeat itself, if it became public, then clearly it is an unjust action. Now, we have to admit that in some situations this might depend somewhat on the public not being completely rotten and evil. Because otherwise they might let get someone away with committing crimes, right? We can see that, we have seen that the last 2 years in the case of Israel. I mean, there's never in all of history been a genocide that was so openly confessed to. I mean, from the start, you have Israeli politicians, generals, journalists, everyone openly stating we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. Openly stating they wanted hell, they will get hell. Openly stating they are Amalek, when everyone who has a Bible can clearly read in the Bible that God commands genocide of the people of Amalek. God commands killing their men, women, children, babies, even their animals. They have not hidden that. I mean, Israeli soldiers have put their war crimes online, have posted themselves on TikTok, blowing up empty buildings while laughing about it, raiding abandoned homes, the inhabitants having fled or having been killed, and then playing with children's toys or with women's underwear. All of this is known. At least if you want to know it. It's not hard to know about this. And still, the West let Israel get away with it. So the fact that the Israelis are so open about their genocide, that they have openly stated we are committing genocide to a degree that even the Nazis didn't dare to openly state it. It either shows that they are very secure in their impunity, or it shows that they simply don't care. They simply don't think about whether this could ruin their public image. But of course, even in that case, we can still see it having an effect. We can still see it not completely defeating their purpose so far in the short term, but in the long term, it probably will end up doing so, because it has led to a big backlash. It has led to everyone who's not a complete scumbag boycotting Israel and so on. I mean, there was, for example, the case of Israelis like to sing the song May Your Village Burn. It's sung by school children on the bus. It's sung at parties. It's sung by soldiers. And this one musician who sings this song, he was singing it in front of soldiers who celebrated. And in some TV show, in some talk show or something, he got attacked for that. He got criticized for that. He got asked, how could you sing May Your Village Burn in front of our soldiers? But to be clear, he was not asked this on moral grounds. Like, the other person was not saying this is immoral. What kind of person sings that? What kind of person celebrates genocide in a song? But rather, he was attacked on pragmatic grounds. The other person was saying this does not look good for our country on the world stage. Indeed, South Africa, when accusing Israel of genocide in front of the international court, quoted exactly such actions as proof of the genocide. And this is a very good reflection of Israeli discourse, right? You have basically no one in Israel being against genocide. The only positions are let's openly celebrate genocide and brag about it, or let's commit genocide, but let's do it quietly and at least pretend we are decent people, so that we don't lose face in front of the international community. By the way, the musician just replied, well, it's just a fact what I was singing, right? We are burning their village, so how can it be back to openly stated? And he got lots of applause from the audience. So that's Israeli society for you. But this, for Kant, is how we should judge whether something is unjust. And this is a principle that he bases all of his philosophy of public right on. So in upcoming lectures, when I will discuss various topics, such as is there a right to a revolution in a state, or such as how should wars be conducted, like can we be deceitful in wars and so on, all I will have to do is come back to this principle, to this maxim of publicity, because that is how Kant will always answer these questions. If this cannot be done publicly, openly, if it can only be done by keeping it hidden, then it is probably unjust. But Kant also goes one step further and says we can also say that, on the other hand, if a certain maxim not just can stand the publicity without defeating itself, but rather even requires publicity, can only work if it is known by everyone, then it is just. So take, for example, the state prohibiting murder. hypothetically, this could be a secret, right? It's not written down in the books of law that murder is forbidden, so everyone thinks that murder is allowed. And if somebody murders, the state persecutes the murderer in secret. So the state, the police secretly tries to find out who the murderer is, and then he gets secretly abducted, and he gets a hidden trial, and he gets punished without the public knowing about it. In theory, this could be done, but it is very clear that this would be stupid, right? Um, you would maybe punish this individual murderer, but you would not prevent further murder, because other potential murderers would not know that it is forbidden and that it has negative consequences for them. So clearly, this prohibition of murder only works if the state publicly announces it. If everyone knows that he should not murder others, and that if he does, he will get punished for it. So that, to Kant, is how we know that this is a just law. Not only can it stand publicity, it even requires publicity in order to work. And here I could end this lecture on public justice, but I want to point out one more thing, and that is that this maxim of publicity, or principle of truth, while maybe being meant to be employed in the area of right and to judge what is just, it can, Kant says, also be employed in the area of ethics to judge what is good. We just have to use it in a slightly different manner, because ethics is, after all, about your own goodwill, not just your outer actions, but rather about the will that you have. And the principle of ethics, I discussed that in my previous lecture on why there needs to be a state. The principle of ethics is the old maxim honeste vive, so live honestly, live an honest, honorable life. And therefore, Kant says the question here should not be, if my maxim was known, would it defeat itself? That would be the case in some cases. Like, some things are forbidden by ethics, like murder, like theft, that are also at the same time forbidden by right. And therefore, here in these cases, yes, the maxim cannot be known, otherwise it would defeat itself. But there are other parts of ethics, for example, everything that belongs to the duties towards myself, but also the wider duties towards others. All of this I discussed in previous lectures, where I could make it known that I'm going to behave in a bad, in an evil manner, without thereby defeating my purpose. But, Kant says, I would at least lose my honor. I would at least lose people's respect. And so here the question, when applying the maxim of publicity, should not be, if my maxim became public, would that defeat itself? Would it then not longer be possible to do this action? But rather, how would people think of me? How would it influence their opinion of me? So imagine a person every day when he comes home from work, just gets completely blackout drunk. Now, if he told that to everyone, to his colleagues, to people he meets, clearly that would not stop him from doing so, right? He could still get drunk every day. But some people would probably think less of him for that. Or likewise, I mean, think of all the things, all the disgusting things that people do online. So, for example, there are people that take pictures of women from social media, like from Facebook or from Instagram, and then they use AI to turn them into nudes, and then they masturbate to that. Um, Imagine someone doing that. uh, he will probably keep it hidden from his colleagues, from his friends, from his family, from his wife. Imagine if it came out. Uh, he could continue doing so. I mean, people knowing about that doesn't mean they can do anything to stop him. He could still look at random Instagrams and still use AI to turn the pictures into nudes. But people would probably lose respect for him. People would probably cancel him. His wife would probably leave him. And through this, Kant would say, he could know that what he is doing is wrong, um, because it would cost him his honor. It would cost him his good name. And one and the same action um, would probably lead to people thinking of you in different ways if they knew why you are doing that action. And again, if we are staying in the area of right, that doesn't matter. Here it's only about your actions. But if we are in the area of ethics, that is all that matters, that you have the goodwill. So imagine a person is donating lots of money to good causes. Uh, Now, if everyone knew about that, they would probably say, oh, this is a good person. He is caring, he is trying to make the world a better place, he's giving to charity. But now imagine it became known that this person is only donating money because of tax benefits. That he doesn't give a shit about the people he's helping. It happens to help, sure, but he's not doing it in order to help, but he's just doing it because then he has to pay less taxes. Well, if this came out, it would not defeat its purpose, right? Because the tax laws don't ask you about your reasons for donating. They ask only, do you donate? So he would still get the tax benefits. But people would probably stop honoring him for his donations. On the other hand, let's imagine you are donating lots of money. Maybe you're donating half your income. Maybe you are living in an extra frugal manner, only paying for the absolute necessities in order to be able to donate as much money as possible to the poor. But nobody knows about this. Maybe you don't even want people to know about this because you don't want to be celebrated. You're not doing it to be seen as a hero, but rather you are only doing it because you think it's the right thing to do. Still, um, if you ever were unsure for some reason that this is the right thing, you would have to only ask yourself, what if people knew? I may keep it secret, but if somehow this came out and everyone knew about this, how would people react? And the answer is, of course, that people would probably think I'm a good person, that I would probably be highly esteemed in many people's eyes because of donating so much money. So, in that sense, you can employ the maxim of publicity also in ethics. Kant says you should always act in a public spirit, meaning you don't have to make everything public that you do, or all the reasons why you do it. Indeed, maybe you should not always brag about what a good person you are, about all the heroic things you have done, but you should always act in such a manner that you don't have to fear things becoming public. You should act in such a manner that you would not have to feel ashamed if all of your actions became publicly known. Kant at one point says, don't take advantage of the fact that your heart has window shutters. So what he means by that is act as if you could not keep things hidden. Act as if you were forced to announce everything you do to everyone. And act so that if this was the case, you would not have to be ashamed. Act so that you could stand everything you do being public. And I will add to that if you are religious, then that would mean that you indeed believe that this is the case, right? That you believe that your heart does not have window shutters, or at least it may have window shutters as concerns other human beings, but it does not have shutters that shut off the gaze of God, right? If you're religious, then you believe that everything you do is seen and is judged by God. Now, clearly, this goes to prove that most people who claim and who may actually think that they are religious are in fact not religious, because they believe they live their life as if there was no God, as if what a lot of things they are doing were not seen. I only have to think back. I mean, I live here in an area of Berlin with lots of Turkish and Arabic immigrants, and there are lots of, especially amongst the young, there are lots who pretend to be oh so great premium Muslims, and in fact they are not. So there was a case at my old school where in one class there was this one guy who always acted like this great Muslim, always telling people what is haram, what they mustn't do. And then on some class trip, his classmates caught him making out with a girl. And they were like, hey, isn't that haram? And he answered, under the bridge, God doesn't see. Which, of course, is completely stupid. And it can only mean one of two things. Either he doesn't believe in God at all, because if there's a God, I'm pretty sure he also sees what's happening under the bridge or on some class trip. Or he may believe that there is a God, but at least he does not believe that this God thinks of making out with a girl you are not married to as something bad that he will punish. But if you are truly religious, then you will believe, and that is a very serious belief. If you really are truly religious, if you really do take this seriously, if you really think this through, then you believe that nothing, not a single thing you do, not even the smallest action, not even you picking your nose in the privacy of your room, nothing is ever completely hidden. There's always someone, that is God, who is watching it and who is judging you for it. And indeed, that is what religion means to Kant. I will talk about this more when I get to his philosophy of religion, but to him, religion is simply conscientiousness. It is simply acting precisely in that manner as if every single action of yours was seen and judged. So acting in such a manner that you can stand for that action in front of God's throne, because you will indeed have to stand for it if there is a God. I already gave a lecture about conscientiousness, and there I said that to Kant, having conscience means only doing things if you are sure that they are just and righteous, and that means only doing if you could bet on this. And then you have to ask yourself, how much would I bet? Would I bet money? Would I bet my life? And the highest possible bet is betting your eternal felicity. So standing in front of God's throne and saying, I am so sure that this action I did was right, that if it wasn't, you may throw me into hell. I'm sure that I don't deserve hell for this. And Kant would say, if there is a God, then indeed, whether you like it or not, whether you think about it or not, you are constantly, with every single action, even picking your nose, betting your eternal felicity. You are, because he's constantly watching, right? So if the action you are doing is bad, is deserving of hell, then sucks for you. So if there is a God, then indeed we certainly have to act according to this maxim of publicity. However, this maxim, while it works well in the area of right, it doesn't work quite as well in the area of ethics, because here it depends very much on the public that gets to know about your maxim being made up of good people, right? In the area of right, it's not necessarily dependent on others being good, because here the question is just, could everyone agree with your action? And maybe people disagree with your action not out of the goodness of their heart, but out of their own egoism. But still they would disagree. So if you try to murder someone, if that became public, the person you want to murder doesn't need to be a good person. It could be the most evil person, but still out of his own egoism, he will not agree with being murdered, and so your maxim will defeat itself. But now in the area of ethics, it's not about whether the maxim would necessarily and certainly defeat itself. It's just about how would people judge you. And that, of course, depends on how good they themselves are. And this is precisely the reason why Kant says, don't act in such a manner that if it was known, you would actually necessarily gain honor, but rather that if it was known, you would deserve being honored. Because that's not the same, right? Being deserving of honor or actually being honored. Because clearly we live in a world where often people will judge you for doing something which isn't bad. And in other cases, they may not judge you for doing something which is bad. I mean, just ask yourself, if you happen to like wearing pink lace underwear as a man, and this became known. And then on the other hand, ask yourself if you happen to once or twice every year book a flight to fly somewhere on vacation, and this became known. What would do more damage to your reputation? What would you rather prefer to keep hidden from your friends, your colleagues, people that pass you by on the street? That you as a man wear pink lace underwear, or that you keep flying on vacation? Even though, and this is not something that you can have different opinions about, this is not something where we can disagree on, unless you are a climate change denier, in which case there cannot be a rational discussion with you anyway, because you have refused to engage with rationality and with science. Even though, clearly, the second action is much, much more evil than the first. I mean, wearing pink lace underwear, the only reason why men shouldn't do that is because society says so. I mean, there's nothing inherently bad about that. You are not harming anyone. I mean, unless maybe you have ordered the pink lace underwear off of Amazon, but then again, you should not feel ashamed about people knowing that you wear pink lace underwear. You should be ashamed about people knowing that you order stuff off Amazon and that you support exploitation. So that is very important for me to stress, because otherwise this maxim of publicity in the area of ethics could lead to people misjudging. And I've seen such cases, right? I've been in situations where someone said, oh, you kept this hidden from others, you kept this hidden from your friend. That proves that you yourself secretly knew that it was wrong. And of course, it doesn't prove that. If someone keeps something hidden from everyone, that may prove that he thinks that they believe it is wrong. But that's not the same as thinking that it is wrong, right? I mean, let's say you are gay. Not very long ago, it was better to keep that hidden. Still, in many, many areas of the world, many parts of society, it's still better to keep that hidden, right? You would be ostracized, maybe even persecuted for it. That doesn't prove that being gay is bad. If anything, it proves that these people who would ostracize or persecute you are bad. So the principle is not, don't do something that, if people knew you were doing it, would result in you losing your honor. But rather, don't do something that, if good people knew you were doing it, would result in you losing your honor. And unfortunately, this only shows how bad the world is, and how absolutely immoral most people in this current world are. Because if you look around at public figures like celebrities, politicians, activists, you see that there are many who very publicly engage in evil. So that in a society of rational, of somewhat decent people, everyone would spit on the ground every time this person passes by. But in fact, they can do these things, and it doesn't result in them getting cancelled. It doesn't result in them losing their reputation. And on the other hand, you have people who constantly publicly do good and act with the utmost integrity, who are still vilified. I mean, think of Greta Thunberg. Certainly, by far, the best person that has been in the public in a long time. And there's pretty much nothing bad you can say about her. There's not a single instance in, by now, about 8 years of her being in the public eye, there's not a single instance that anyone can name where she lied, where she was dishonest, where she didn't show character. And she has always consistently fought for justice, fought for the oppressed. And still, people attack her. People smear her. People tell lies about her. People call her a crazy, manipulated child or an anti-Semite or whatever. And on the other hand, you have people like, you have Trump, who constantly lies, and it's very much a proven fact that no one can possibly dispute. But still, it doesn't prevent him from winning an election and becoming US president, right? Or you have someone like Elon Musk, who, first off, is just a cringy, overgrown man-child, who constantly posts cringy memes, who constantly falls for fake news. Like, in a single day, several times, he may retweet some very obvious fake news that 5 seconds of internet research could have shown to him are fake news. It is known that he supports far right, that he supports racist causes all around the world. It is, he did a Nazi salute twice on stage. And on top of that, it is also known how he treats his own children and their mothers, the women he is with, like utter shit. And still he has this cult following. Still, there are so many people supporting him. Yeah, or you have a musician like Taylor Swift, who basically every single day uses her private jet, who single-handedly does more damage to the climate than whole villages, whole towns of people. And still, people buy her music, people go to her concerts, buy her concert tickets, which only can lead to one possible conclusion, that all these people supporting someone like Swift or like Musk or like Trump, every single one of them, they themselves are not good people. They themselves have no human decency. Because otherwise, they would look at such completely rotten people. And I mean, everyone who is rich like that is rotten anyways. I mean, you don't even have to look at their actions. You cannot be a moral billionaire. It's not possible. If you have that much money, there is blood on your hands. That's for sure. But instead of these people losing all their honor, losing all their reputation in the public eye, they still find lots of supporters. And that goes to show how rotten that public must be. So that's why I want to stress you can use the maxim of publicity in the area of ethics, asking yourself not would my maxim, if it was public, defeat itself, but would it lead to me gaining honor or dishonoring myself? But it only works if you don't apply it to the actual public, to actual people around you as they are, because as they are, they might be very bad people. It only works if you apply it to an ideal public. If you say, if I was in a society of completely good people, how would they judge me for it? But anyways, that is the maxim of publicity, and that is the principle by which we can also judge ethics, but mainly can judge what is right, what is just. And now with that, as I already said, we can apply that to the various levels of the public right. As I said, the public right, Kant divides according to the categories of quantity to the state right, the nation's right, and the cosmopolitan right. And in my upcoming lectures, I want to discuss all three of those and talk about what Kant has to say about those. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.